Good afternoon. This is, ladies and gentlemen. Uh, Thanks to T2 and the Pratibha Khaitan Foundation, and of course Mr. Baturia. Such a lovely functions we keep having at the Taj Bengal. Um, so how do we introduce Zac? So somebody who was a playwright, he was a musician, and he retired at 25 and started writing books, and he wrote some 11 super books. And 13 now, okay, sorry. And he created a character like Hari Majestic because he was found in a cinema hall, Majestic Cinema. And then he went into the underbelly of a city like Bengaluru, went deep into it and writes about the city. And I think the Hindu, a famous the grand old lady Hindu says that detective fiction, unlike any other fiction written. So that's high praise. So there's only one last request, which is that when you're going to get into the underbelly of Kolkata, and that's when we'll say, oh yeah. Okay.
Well, yeah, I've been asked several times to send Hari Majestic to Kolkata, so I have to take it under consideration. He needs a good case and a good cause to come here first.
Thank you, Sandeep, for this event. It's something that many of us are very fond of. This format works brilliantly, I think. And Zac, welcome to Kolkata once again on such a lovely afternoon after the rains.
Thank you very much.
The city of Pradosh Mitter and Bomkesh Bakshi. One of the biggest hit songs in Kolkata right now is a song called Kolkata, Kolkata, which has got this line that if you don't, this is a song which has got this line which says, if you can't show me Bomkesh Bakshi's house, I'll not talk to you or whatever. So this is a...
oh, can you show me his house then?
So it's Zac, as some of you may know, is a polymath. I mean, he's been in theatre, he's been a theatre producer, director, actor, lighting designer, he's been a pop musician. Is there anything you haven't done? I mean, I'm just looking through your CV. He's also a polyglot, like he English, of course, and Swedish, Finnish. You were born in Finland,
right,
but grew up in Sweden, but also Hindi, Kannada, Tamil, smattering of Bengali. Yeah.
No Bengali actually, no. And even my Kannada skills are very rudimentary.
Right.
Like Swalpa.
It's better than our Finnish, I think.
Better than your Finnish, yes, definitely.
Right. And of course, I mean, the books. I mean, Zac is famous in India, I think, for his crime fiction, but he writes in a number of genres. Crime fiction, of course. One of his
fiction. Serious fiction. I mean,
serious
like
fiction,
when I was younger.
yes. Yes, I mean, of course, there is the novel that you have, lot of your, someone said that it's the best novel he has read in a long time. I was reading on your...
yeah, some people have said strange things like that, but but that was like when I was younger and more pretentious, I tried to write serious fiction. Now I have my sights set on...
But you've also written on Mahatma Gandhi. You have
That's
written a hugely popular travelogue on India. It's not available in English, but I think a lot of Scandinavians come to India with that in hand, and it's a really sort of intimate introduction to India, as it were. I mean, not just the touristy stuff, but other things.
Yeah, that was my first book. It was really like a book I wrote on Indian culture when I was traveling here after I had retired at the age of 25 and looking at basically my way of getting to know India at that time was to meet all the cultural people, the dancers and the theatre people and writers and filmy people and heavy metal musicians and that kind of things, and just looking at trying to understand Indian culture through these people. And so my first book was about those experiences. And in Sweden, at that time, this is actually now more than 20 years ago. So at that time, there was no internet, so you couldn't really Google on all these things. So that's why the book became very popular, because it was the first proper glimpse of modern Indian culture that the Scandinavian people got.
Yeah.
So in those years when I came to India, I used to see people walking around with that book and looking lost in the streets, and then I would know that these are Swedish people.
We'll come to that in a bit. But Zac is also a translator. He introduces a lot of Indian authors, from Pankaj Mishra to Bankim Chattopadhyay, to readers in Sweden. And you've worked extensively in cultural relations as well subsequently with the Swedish Embassy, getting artists in Sweden to collaborate with artists in India. So that's absolutely fascinating. So if I may just start off by saying, crime fiction. Is this, why did you start off? Is this the best way to get away with murder?
Well, actually, I've never been in a jail. Like, that's one of those things that I haven't been. I haven't been a prisoner.
Around.
But when you write crime fiction, at some point you think that maybe somebody will get provoked enough that you get sued and put in jail. Or that's one possible way of looking at it. But the other thing is that I grew up reading detective fiction. When I was a child, like 8, 9 years old, I would read all of Agatha Christie and Sherlock Holmes and try to write in that genre. But this was in the 70s, and at that point of time, crime fiction was seen as a very negative thing in Sweden, where I grew up, because all the progressive writers call it like a literary weed, and it should be uprooted, and the crime writers should stop writing all these terrible things that they did. And so even I got affected by that, and then I thought, like, if I'm going to write anything, let me be a serious writer and write serious things. So I was kind of sidetracked for a long time trying to write the great Swedish novel, which I obviously failed doing properly. But then in the 1990s, what happened was that there were some Swedish writers like Henning Mankell. You may have heard of his books, are in all the bookshops here. He passed away last year. And I knew him a little bit. So it was very sad when he passed away, because I had to write his obituary in some papers and magazines. But he started writing crime fiction, and he published his first detective novel in 1991. Before that, he had been a theater personality and done a lot of work in Zimbabwe, not in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, in Africa. He had worked with theater companies to develop theater in Africa. And then he started writing crime fiction as a retirement insurance, so that he'll have some money to, when he wanted to retire. And those became like phenomenally popular in Swedish, and everybody was reading them. And they were made into films, first in Sweden with Swedish actors, then they were translated into English and into some 30, 40 other languages. And they were made into films in England with Kenneth Branagh starring as the detective
Wallander.
inspector Wallander.
Yeah.
And I believe he sold some like 30, 40 million copies.
It's hugely popular.
Yeah, and then another writer called Stieg Larsson came along about 10 years later.
Yeah.
And he was also starting to write crime fiction as a sort of kind of retirement policy sort of thing, because he was running a magazine called Expo in Stockholm, which was about exposing like right-wing criminal organizations and fighting against racism in Europe. And he was really an expert in that field. But he realized that he wasn't making any money on that, so he started writing something called the Millennium Trilogy. The first book was called A Girl with a Dragon Tattoo in English, and it was made into a film. First in Swedish,
popular.
and then
It's massively popular.
it was made into a film with Daniel Craig in Hollywood also.
Yeah.
And so his books have sold some 80 million copies worldwide. So he's even outsold Henning Mankell. The sad thing about this thing with him is that before the first book was published, he actually passed away because he was a heavy smoker, and his office was on the 8th floor in a building in Stockholm. So one day when the elevator was broken down, he had to walk up 8 floors to his office, and then when he opened his office door, he fell down with a massive heart attack and died.
So basically, climbing stairs skills,
It-
not smoking.
Not
yeah?
the smoking, but the
Not the
climbing
climbing
stairs would have been
stairs.
or broken elevators.
Broken elevators kill, yeah.
Kill you.
Don't say
So-
smoking kills.
But anyway, so so these like people who sell 40 million copies or 80 million copies, like this, just to give you an idea of the numbers of, I mean, the size of the Swedish crime fiction industry. And there are like new detective novels published every day of the week. New debut authors are coming, like every week there's some new author coming up. And also lots of women write crime fiction as well. There's lots of, if you go to the bookshops, you may find translations of authors like Camilla Läckberg and Åsa Larsson and Lisa Marklund and several others who have also been very successful and sell basically as much as the male writers.
Zac, I was just wondering, I mean, what is it about Scandinavia and crime fiction? I mean, is there a sort of politics behind
I think
that?
one of the reasons why crime fiction is so popular is because we really haven't had any crime. So people like to imagine what it would be like. And gradually also, of course, I mean, crime has started appearing in Sweden, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union and mafia from the east that has started taking over the drug running and everything in Sweden. So now you have more organized crime in Sweden. So in a way, the crime fiction, it reflects perhaps a reality, and the authors basically have anticipated these developments. I don't think they started off the development. I don't think criminals read books or get inspired by fiction. But crime fiction can give you a kind of analysis of society and what's happening, and because it's fiction, you can speculate. You don't have to just stick to the facts and have proof for everything that you claim in your books, but you can imagine, you know, scenarios of like what kind of crimes we might have to fight in the future, or what kind of problems may come up in society. So this whole thing with the Swedish crime fiction industry, which is actually like most of the Swedish publishing houses run on the revenue from the detective fiction, and the detective fiction is what sort of then sponsors the publishing of poetry and you know, these not so best-selling serious authors. So suddenly it has become very acceptable in Sweden to write crime fiction. It wasn't like when I was a child and when it was seen as a literary read. Now it's seen as a very important component of the Swedish culture. And the Swedes are quite happy to use it as a way to promote Sweden as a tourism destination, for example. I mean, you would imagine that these books that, because crime fiction is essentially about people killing each other, or sometimes they don't kill each other, but usually they kill each other. And so you would imagine that people wouldn't want to come to a country which is known for crime fiction. But what happens is that when a new Swedish crime novel is published in French, for example, then suddenly lots of Frenchmen want to visit that city where it's set. And in Sweden, like in the major cities like Stockholm and Gothenburg, you'll have several different crime fiction series set in those places. But then you'll also have smaller places like Ystad, for example, where Henning Mankell set his novels. I visited that city once, and it's a small place with a population of about 25,000, which is essentially like a big Indian village, you could say. And there you have like serial killers on the loose all the time in Henning Mankell's novels.
So this whole traversing of cultures and places, and all the languages that you know, speak, use, I mean, does that have an impact on your writing? I mean, time, space, but all the languages that you speak.
Yeah, in a way, like because
what is your language of choice when you write? I mean, first choice. I mean, in what language do you think?
South Indian English, like North Bangalore dialect, if you can imagine. So yeah. Well, what happens is like when you belong to many different cultures at the same time, I would like to imagine that one has a slightly wider scope in one's cultural references and the things that you can bring into a book, rather than being, you know, narrowly focused on a small thing. Like most Swedish authors are actually like, they very much focused on exactly where they are. They write about people, their own class, their own educational background, their own type of people, and none of them do what I do, like, because like the hero in the Harry Majestic novels is of course a tout who is a very different kind of character from me. So in Sweden at least it has given me.
So you think?
Yeah. Maybe I was like him in my previous life, and then I was, because of my sins, I was reborn in Finland, near the Arctic Circle, but now I'm back in India. So at least in Sweden, it has given me this reputation of being Sweden's most multicultural author.
Right.
So,
both you and your wife are writers. How do two writers manage a household?
I think very well. I mean, much better than if one was a non-writer, because as writers you can understand each other's work situation, and you can have like a better idea of things, like you don't interfere in the other's work, and because sometimes in writing you work like long hours, and you're so focused on your characters that you start to go slightly insane, and the characters start to sort of how should I say it? They get so internalized that you start acting like the characters, and if you write about some gunda, then start acting like a gunda. That may not be ideal, like in a normal marriage. But since we're both authors, we understand all these psychological things that happen while you write a novel. So that is very good, and that would have been more difficult if one of us hadn't been an author, I think, to understand this whole thing. And then, and the other thing is that when you're two writers in the house, you always have an editor next to you. You can ask for advice, and does this thing work? And free editing basically. Well, barter type of editing.
Yes. You've also written a biography of Gandhi. How did you dare write a biography of Gandhi?
I thought you'd ask something like that.
It's very risky,
Yeah,
biography of Gandhi and Tagore.
But the thing was that in Swedish, there hasn't ever been a proper book on Mahatma Gandhi, and people don't actually know a lot about him. Everybody knows who he was, and that he was influential in liberating India from colonialism and all that, and that he's a big hero, but then there's so much more to him, and so I started thinking, like, let me write like a small pamphlet on Mahatma Gandhi that can be distributed in schools, and just to spread knowledge about all his work in Sweden. And then while I was doing research for the book, I discovered that he was up to so many interesting things. Like, he wasn't just a political activist, but he was also, for example, into ecology and things like that, long before it became popular and
or fashionable.
And village development and things like that, rural development. And he was into diet experiments. Like nowadays, everyone all over the world is experimenting with raw food and things like that. But Gandhi was the first one who I think started chewing on raw lentils and raw rice, just to see if it would be more nutritional or better for his digestion. Of course, what happened was that he lost his teeth because they broke from eating all these raw grains. But he was experimenting with all these things and experimenting with himself. And he wrote about his most best-selling book is his book on food, the Food and Health, which has sold the largest number of copies of all his books. And he was also a journalist. He was a
he's very prolific.
He published his own magazines in several languages, in English, Hindi, Gujarati, and I think one more language. And he was, in a way, I think, like if he had been living today, he would have been like a blogger, because he realized very early on that to be influential, you have to deal with mass media and be a good communicator and all. So he had like lots of theories on that, and he owned his own printing press, so that So today he would have obviously had an iPad, and I mean, if he had lived today, and blogged and things. And he would have loved email, because what happened was that if anybody wrote to Mahatma Gandhi, he would read a letter and then would turn it over and write on the back of the letter. It's basically like to save paper and forest and all that kind of things. So email he probably would have embraced wholeheartedly, because it's
I mean, a lot of similarities with Tagore in that sense as
Yeah.
well, like very prompt with letters and very long letters
Yeah.
too. I was just wondering that if we should pause a little bit there and sort of go out to the audience and
Yeah,
see
just
if it-
yeah. So when I started looking at Gandhi, and I realized all these things, and I felt like explaining about all his work to his speech. Then that pamphlet grew into a book of 600 pages, and that was also a thing. Then the publisher thought this is maybe too big and nobody will buy this. Swedes won't be interested in reading so much about a single person. But again, it sold some 20,000-30,000 copies in a very short span of time. The first edition was over within 4 days. So when I went for my book tour, there was not even a copy left in the shops. So, and it was published in Danish and Norwegian, where it also became very popular. So in a way, I think it was a very good thing of me to do, even though it was audacious to write a book on Mahatma Gandhi. It still showed that there's a great need to know more about him. And
Yeah. Thank you so much, Zac, for being in conversation here, talking to your readers here in Kolkata. If there are no other burning questions, we can, shall we wrap up?